Hello and welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So this is going to be another longer video where all of the content that is in this video is going to correlate with the content from chapter 10, and that's going to be looking at working with forms. And there's not really a good place to break this up into multiple videos just because everything that's in the chapter is really talking about individual pieces of the form. There is a section where it's looking at working with adding CSS to the form, but a lot of it is just letting you know all the individual pieces and everything. So what I'm going to start with is having us look at a PowerPoint. All right, so this PowerPoint is going to be on Canvas, so you can go back and you can reference this if you need to for looking at your quiz, or if you just want to study this and look at it over again, it's on Canvas. So server-side scripting is a technology in which a server-side script is run on a web server to dynamically generate web pages. Examples include PHP, Ruby on Rails, Adobe ColdFusion, Sun, Java Server Pages, and Microsoft.NET. And it uses direct execution, which means the script is run either by the web server itself or by an extension module to the web server. So when you are invoking server-side processing, you're creating this conversation between the web client and the web server. And you can see in the illustration on the left, there's the browser request is being sent from the web client to the web server, and then from the web server, there's a server response. So a web page invokes server-side processing either by using an attribute on a form or by a hyperlink. So in our case, the reason why I'm talking about this is because we are basically going to be creating the front end of what a form would look like. And when you have a form on a website, you are filling out information and you're saying what you want to do with that information. Where do you want to send it? So by clicking on the submit button, we're basically saying, I want to send all this information in the form and I want to send it to wherever that's going to be. So that's using the attribute on a form or using the hyperlink. Any form data that exists is passed to the script. The script is processed and may generate a confirmation or response web page with the requested information. Now, you are not going to be responsible for knowing how to pass the information and what happens with it on the end side of things. We're only going to be thinking about the front end of it, not the back end. And you are not going to be responsible for having to come up with that confirmation message. The textbook has its own example confirmation message, and so if you want to use that in your examples just so you can test that the link is actually working and you can kind of see what happens by having it generate that confirmation message, you can do that, but you're not going to be required to have that. And same thing with your final project, you are going to have a form, but all I need is to see that you know how to write the link to where it would send out. You don't have to have an actual file linked to it. And this will make a little more sense once we start getting into everything. All right, so when you are working with the front end and the back end of this website and you're working with this form that needs to pass information, you need to make sure that both the web developer on the front and the server-side programmer on the back end, that you are agreeing on how you want to send information. So that way everything matches up. So there are going to be a few attributes that you're going to set in your form's opening tag. So there is the form method attribute. So it's an attribute that is called method. And you have two different options for it. You can set it to get or you can set it to post. And then there is the form action attribute. That is going to be the actual address of where you're sending the information to. And that's where the textbook will have some examples of what that'll look like. A lot of times we'll just set the action so it says action equals demo.php or something. And then any special form element controls that would be expected by the server-side script. And that could be like the name or some other attributes. So looking into these in a little further detail, first one, that method attribute. So this is going to look at what is the best practice for what to set the method attribute, so that way you know what to use in the future. So the method attribute is used on the form tag to indicate the way in which the name and value pairs should be passed to the server. Git causes the form data to be appended to the URL, which is easily visible and is not secure, versus post, as a value, does not pass the form information in the URL, but passes it in the entity body of the HTTP request, which makes it more private. So as you can probably imagine, W3C recommends that you set the method attribute to post. So that's what we're going to be doing in all of our examples. That's what I'm going to expect you to do in your homework and your final. In addition to thinking about how you are sending the information to make it secure, it's also important for you to think about how you communicate privacy to your users, so that way they know what sort of information they're being asked to send, what's going to happen to that information, who's going to have access to the information. I'm not going to make it so you have to create a privacy policy for any of your projects, but it's just something that is really good for you to know about. And a lot of times, like let's say that you're creating a website with a CMS like WordPress. In WordPress, it'll actually generate a default privacy policy for you, and then you can go in and you can modify it. So there's ways for you to find information online so you can see what does a typical privacy policy look like, so that way you can have help in writing out your own and figuring out what would work best for you. So just kind of reading through this, a privacy policy lists the guidelines that you develop to protect the privacy of your visitors' information. Websites either indicate this policy on the forum page itself or create a separate page that describes the privacy policy. And a lot of times you'll see the privacy policy links in the footer of your website. That would be a really good place to put it. Include a privacy notice in your site to inform your visitors how you plan to use the information they share with you. So pretty short and sweet and to the point. The biggest thing that you're going to want to remember is this information about the method attribute and the fact that we're going to want to use post for this. And then it's just good to know about this idea of we are sending this conversation back and forth between the web client and the web server. All right, so that's on Canvas for you if you need it. And what I'm going to do is kind of similar to the last video. I'm going to put everything into one file as long as it doesn't get to be so confusing that it's hard to look at everything. And then if it ends up being difficult, then I'll create a new file. And actually, in this case, all of the examples that I'm going to be doing and going through, they're all in the reading. So when you get to doing the reading, there might be a few things that we are not going to do, but if you want to do them on your own, you can do that. If going through them in here, if you feel like you have a good idea of it, you can kind of skim through when you're reading the chapter. But I'm going to be sticking very, very closely to the chapter in this video. All right, so I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to save this as just forms. And then I want to make sure it's HTML. So I'm going to just start this like our typical file. Title will be forms. And for starters, I'm not going to worry about putting in any styles. We're going to be mostly focusing on HTML. When we do get to a point with when we are working with CSS, that's where I might put that in a separate file just so it doesn't end up messing up anything that's in here. And we're basically just going to create one really, really long form that's going to have examples of everything all put together. And again, it's going to be basically the same thing as the textbook. It might differ in just kind of insignificant ways, but nothing really super essential. All right, so there is the form element itself. And I'm going to just put an H1, and I'm just going to say form controls. And then we're going to have our form tag. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit. So in our form tag, I mentioned in the PowerPoint that there's going to be a couple of different attributes that we have to have. So we have to have action, and that is going to be where we are going to send the information. And like the PowerPoint mentions, it could be like a PHP file. There's a lot of different types of files that it could be. In the book, it lists kind of an example PHP file that they're hosting on their own server. I'm just going to have us write demo.php, and that will work fine. As long as you write it this way, it'll still count as being a valid link, even though we don't have a demo.php file that actually exists. So we're going to need action, and then we need method. And again, if you recall to that PowerPoint, we want to choose post because that's going to be preferred and it's going to be more private. And then from here, there's going to be other attributes that we can use, but we don't necessarily have to. So we've kind of covered all the ones that we need to have. So you can use autocomplete on or off, and that's going to make it so if the browser has information to autofill, that it could fill in that information. You can use an ID if you wanted to style this particular form. You can use name, that's also optional. It makes it easier to access by client-side scripting languages. And just a reminder on the idea of working with IDs. So for the most part, when you are working with styling things, it's better to style things with CSS. Now, the exceptions I would say would be things that are interactive, that you want to make sure that you are very specific in how you are pinpointing that information. So things that could be interacted with JavaScript would be a good example. And then in this case, the form elements, because when you're working with a form, you want to be able to pinpoint to very particular parts of the form and be able to style it. So we're going to be using ID a lot for styles. And we're going to be using name. Now, name is what helps to associate information that's going to get passed on to the back end as well. And you want to make sure that the names that you choose are going to be things that are going to make sense. And the names would be something that you want to make sure you and the person who's working on the back end would agree on. All right, but in this case, we don't need an ID and we don't need a name. If we wanted to, though, we could just put in name equals, I'll just put order. I think that's what the book had. ID equals order. The ID and the name don't have to be the same, but for the most part, if it's logical, I would say it's probably better for it to be as similar as possible. But the name is something that you need to make sure that you agree on with whoever's working on the other end of the data. The ID, though, that's something where you're working with yourself and working with your style sheet. So if they had to be different, the ID is going to be one that's going to be easier for you to change because it's going to be you working on your HTML and your CSS versus the name is the one where you're working with someone else. All right, so that's going to be our form. And you can just see we've got form open and end tag. And then everything else we're going to have is going to go in between this. So I would just hit return, and then we'll just continually add things into here. So the form is going to have a bunch of different items inside of it. And the biggest one that we're going to see a lot of use of is called the input element. And it has a lot of different ways that it can be visualized. So I'm going to actually go to our Canvas. All right, so in your final project, you're going to be required to have certain pieces in your form. So include appropriate examples of these elements, include matching label elements for all form elements. So you're going to have labels, You'll notice here that there is input type text, input type submit, input type reset, input type checkbox, input type radio, input type date. So these are all input elements, and they have a type attribute that sets them different ways, so that way they can behave and look differently. So these are all one element that's used in a multitude of different ways. So you're going to have all of these that you're going to need to do. And then there's going to be a text area element, and then there's a select and option element that you're going to use as well. So the reason I wanted to mention this is just so you can kind of get an idea that the majority of the things that we're going to look at are all going to be one type of element. It's just modified in various ways. And then there's going to be a few other elements that you can use too, but they end up being pretty different. So, but also you need to have, for the final, you need to have at least one input type with text. That would be a text box where you could type things in. And then the second one, this is a submit button, and then there's a reset button. And then you're going to need to have at least one checkbox, and that's going to kind of depend. You know, it could make sense for you to have just one. Maybe you're checking on or off if you want to be able to, like maybe it's like subscribing to a newsletter and you want to say, I do or do not want to be contacted. You could have somebody have a checkbox, and you might just have one. Radio buttons, those are ones where you can choose different options, and so it would make the most sense for you to have multiple things to choose from. Input type date, that's just going to be you being able to choose a date, like a little calendar. Text area, that's where you can type in a bunch of comments, so it's kind of that bigger box. And then select an option, this is where you have a drop down menu where you can click on it and then select from multiple options, and we'll go over what all of these are, but I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of what the end result ask is going to be for that. And then looking at the homework, this is also going to have a form, but it's going to be a little bit different from the final. And this one you are going to need to have a couple of text boxes. So this would be an input type text. This would also be input type text for email, phone. So these are all just text boxes. And then here you can see that we have well, it looks kind of like it's a text area, but it's a drop down box where you can choose these different options. And then there's a button to request information. Now, just a warning, this is going to be done with a grid. And so you want to make sure that when you are going through the reading, that you look for this area that says form layout with CSS grid. And just like I've said in previous videos, if you look to the examples in the book, you can usually find something that is very similar to what the homework is going to have. And so here we've got hands-on practice 10.5. This looks very similar. It has the labels that are in the left column. There's a placeholder column where there's nothing in here. There's the input text boxes. There's you won't have a text area, but you'll have something kind of similar. And then there is going to be an input submit button. And so it shows you what that looks like with a wireframe, how you can kind of see how that would be gridded out with the line grids. It shows you what this would look like with the form, and this will make more sense once we start talking about labels, but it shows you how you can work with those labels. And then here it has a really good example of what the CSS template would sort of look like, including what's going to be the hardest part, which is going to be figuring out how to have the submit button be in the second column instead of the first column by default. But you really shouldn't have an issue with the homework so long as you reference these two pages, because all you would have to do is figure out what the values are different in your homework and then come and look at this and see how you can modify it. So it's not going to be a complete match, but it'll end up being really similar. So that's on page 366 and page 367 if you want to take a look at that later. All right, so back to our form. as I said, we have our input element, and it is used to configure several different types of form controls. It is not coded as a pair of opening and closing tags. It's kind of like the image, where it's just going to have a single tag. And it can use various different type attributes, and those are used to specify what kind of form control it's going to be. So what I'm going to have us do is we're going to start off with, let's see, I think, whoops, do H2, and I'm just going to put in input type text element. Oh, hang on, I'm trying to think of, because I want to make sure. So input element, that's the element, type text. So it's the input element that has the type set to text. This is going to be what this one looks like. And then we're going to do input type equals text. And then there's a couple other things that we could add to this. So you could say the name and the ID. Other attributes would be having size, which would be how many characters would be visible, maximum length, so how much can you type in, the value, and that's going to be more relevant to other types. Disabled, read only, autocomplete, autofocus, list, placeholder, required, access key, tab index. And if you're kind of curious about any of those, I'm going to explain some of them as we go along as they're relevant. But if you're interested, your book will have a table where it'll go into a lot of detail on each of those. So I'm just going to have us do name, and we can set that equal to email, ID equal email, and just leave it at that. So no closing tag, everything just is going to be in that first part. Now, if we wanted to have text next to our item, I could say like email over here, just do colon, and that would show up for now. Now this would be a placeholder. Eventually we would want to add labels, but we're not going to go over those. I'm trying to keep this in the same order as what it would be introduced in the textbook. And so for now we're just going to have kind of placeholder text floating next to it. And then if you do not put in a break, then everything is just going to fill in next to each other. So what I'm going to have us do to keep things pretty organized is after the end of each of these, we're just going to add a couple breaks. And then eventually I'll show you how to work with styles, and you won't have to worry about that so much. All right, so then the next one that I want to introduce is going to be trying to make sure my indentation matches. Okay, so this one is going to be the input element type submit button. Actually, let's do types submit and reset buttons. So we're going to have an input type submit and an input type reset. Now these get talked about in your book right next to each other because they have a lot of things in common. So as you can imagine, the submit button triggers the action method on the form tag, which means that it sends the information to wherever you said it was going to in the action. So for us, that's the demo.php. So it sends form data to the web server. And then the reset button resets the form fields to their initial values. Some common attributes for these buttons would be name, ID, value, access key, and tab index. So we could go in and we could add in name and ID and set those to submit as well. But something that I think is going to be a little more interesting to explore is, so if you don't put in a value, you'll just get kind of the default submit and reset words on your button. But if you want to change the wording on your button, you can actually use value to change that. So like, let's say I want to turn this into a subscription. I could put subscribe on there for the value, and that would show up on the button now. And then with the input type reset, I could set that to clear form, and then that's going to be what shows up on here. Now, since this is normally at the bottom of the form, I'm going to have this basically be the bottom of our form, and then as we add things, I'm going to slowly spread these out. So it's important that you get everything working here. Now, let me save that and actually open this up. All right, so this is what we have so far, and I would really suggest looking at it in a couple of different browsers. I might open up, right now I'm in Firefox, I might open up Chrome and Safari kind of down the line just to show how different certain parts are. For now, everything will be pretty similar no matter what you have open. So we've got our text box, which is going to open up, and then we've got subscribe now with the exclamation mark, and we've got clear form. And actually, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and open it at least with, but you'll see like these buttons and how they're styled kind of looks a little bit different. But for the most part, there's nothing too different. Each of them are kind of glowing this blue color if you are clicking on it. All right, so we've got our input element with our text type and our submit button and reset buttons. This is kind of the easiest part. And then the next two, these also are going to get introduced together as a set. And that's going to be our check box and radio buttons. And that's because they work sort of similar to each other. So you could have people type out information, but and in this case, it makes sense. If you're working with an email, it makes sense that you would want to type everything out. But you really want to try to remove error, and you want to really just think about ways to create better user experiences. So you want to remove errors. You want to think about, something like, what are the methods that you prefer to be contacted? Usually you can anticipate most ways that people would want to be contacted: phone, email, text message, etc. And so you can list all of those different options, and then people can click on which option that they want to be contacted by. And so because there's not a whole lot of different options, being able to click on something is going to be a lot easier than having to type something out and having to type in phone, and maybe you accidentally have a typo or something, and you'd have to take into consideration all those possibilities for someone having different typos. So if you can avoid it, you want to try to make it so people don't have to type things out. And then you want to try to list the most common options. And then if you think that there could be another option, you could list other, and then you could leave a place where someone could fill in that information. So check boxes and radio buttons, they allow the user to select one or more of a group of predetermined items. So the idea here is these are all predetermined by us for someone to choose from. Now, with the checkbox, you can select multiple options, but with the radio button, you can only choose one. So we're going to start with our checkbox. It's going to be input type equals checkbox. And some different attributes for this would be also name, ID, checked, value, disabled, autofocus, required, access key, tab index. So you could have some text above here. Maybe we want to have I'm trying to think of what would make sense. We could have a H3. Say check all that apply. And so we could have this, and then we could say name. And since I mentioned the option, we can think of this as like, how would you prefer to be contacted? So we could have one that says phone, for example. And so you would say name, phone, ID would also be called phone. And then here's where value comes in. So we say value is yes. So what's going to happen here is if this is clicked on, yes will get passed, that value of yes will get passed through name to the back end of the server. And so it'll know to do something with that. And that's where you'd have to program whatever that's going to be. And then we're going to just have some free floating text, just like we had with email, that's going to go on either side of it. And so this would just say phone, for example. And then if we want this to go on the next line, we have to add a break for this one. And then I'm going to just copy this. And I'll switch this to email. Now we've already got a name and an ID called email. So if we really want to do this, we might have to do this separately. We might have to say check email or whatever sort of makes sense. Versus this is the actual email, and then this is a check option for email. Or maybe instead of saying check email, maybe this is checkbox 1. So like the option for checkbox 1. And this is where comments can be really helpful when you're going through and you're doing your CSS. So that way you can remember a little better, what exactly was CH box, So we're just kind of doing this short abbreviation for our checkbox. So we've got checkbox option 1 and 2, and I was going to do email, phone and email. So those are 2 options. So we can click on either one of those, and then we'll do an H3 and say check the best option. This is going to be our radio button. We'll have input type equals radio. I could do something similar here. Maybe do like RD. Actually, I could probably just do radio 1. ID radio 1, and then here, actually, you know what? So the radio is gonna work a little different because you can only use one, and the way that this works is the logic is going to be different, where you will have multiple values that you can pass on to the same place. So they're all going to share the same name. So this will be called radio. And then ID can be whatever you want. So you could say this is going to be radio 1. So it's the first option for radio. And then here with value, you're going to pass on this information. So maybe we've got the value here is going to be called phone. And then I'm just going to copy this. So name is also going to be radio, so it's going to be different. These will be the same, and then we need to have a different ID for our styles. If we wanted to style it different, we could. And then this value would turn into email. All right, so let me just save that. I'm going to try to keep that on the screen so you can double check your work. So now we've got 2 checkboxes where you could have 1, none, or both of them checked. And then once you have one of these radio buttons checked, you're going to have to always have one of them, but you can't have 2 of them. And if you don't want that anymore, you could just click on clear form and it'll remove that for you. And our text is showing up to the right just because that's our free floating text that's on the right side. I think for things like this where it's a checkbox or radio button, I think this looks a lot nicer having those inputs on the left. It's a lot smoother to go through. Right now this text is really about the same length, but if you have your options all sorts of different lengths, if you were to put the text on the left side, then these would kind of zigzag back and forth and be a little bit harder to work with. And then we've got our other buttons. All right, so next your book talks about, and I might be doing these in a slightly different order than the book, but I'm going to try to keep the pairings the same. So the book then mentions H2. I'll do that, H2. So we've got hidden field, password, box, and file upload. Whoops. They kind of put those all as a grouping together. So with the hidden field, that allows you to store text or numeric information that is not visible to the browser viewport. So it could be information that is still part of your form that's important to just hang on to and be able to have, but it's something that doesn't necessarily need to be seen by the user. So maybe it's even just like your username information or something where you'd already logged in and is keeping track of that. Or maybe it's keeping track of like a coupon or something and you just don't need to see it right now. And so some common attributes for that would be like name, ID, value, disabled. And that's just going to be input type equals hidden. And I'm going to keep it really simple like this. I'll put a break after this and I'm going to just put text. The input type hidden is above here. So that way we'll know where it is. Basically, it would go in the regular flow of everything, but you're just not going to see it at all. So we'll be able to see the text that's next to it so we can kind of see the absence of where it's at. And then our password, that's going to allow us to put in password information. So it's used to accept information that must be hidden as it's entered. Some common attributes here: name, ID, size, maximum length, value, disabled, read only, autocomplete, autofocus, placeholder, required, and access key. Now required would be a really great one to put here. So we can do required. Now some of these attributes, you can just type in like required. And that's where they often will be like required equals required. Things like that you see a lot of times, you can just shorten it and just type in required. But I would suggest doing it like this just so you make sure that you don't have any errors. So we could do something like this. We'll have another instance later being able to use placeholder, but I think required will be a good one for our password. And if we wanted to, we could put some text to the side of it and say, type in password here, for example. All right, so the last one is file upload control, and it allows you to, provides for the file to be uploaded. So it's gonna be input, type, and then that is gonna be called file. So some different attributes for this would be like accept, capture, and multiple. So you could do multiple ones at one time. So I'm going to modify this a little bit. I'm going to put profile photo. So maybe we're uploading our profile picture here. We have our input type file, and then I'm just going to go ahead and put name is equal to photo. And then we can say what kind of file we're going to accept. So I can say that I'm going to accept image files. So let's put a break after that and I'll save that. And then let's refresh these. So now I have the input type hidden is above here. So we've got just this empty space up here. We've got our password box, which if I type in here, it'll just conceal what that looks like. If I try to click on subscribe, it's going to give me this error. Please fill out this field because it's now required. Let me check out what these look like. So here I've got where it's being able to keep track of different passwords I've got saved. Let's see what happens if I try to subscribe. It looks like it's briefly trying to do a pop-up, but for some reason it wasn't showing up very well. So now it is. Fill out this field. So it gives you some direction of what you need to do. Then let me refresh this one. For some reason, it's not letting me scroll. All right, so here we've got our password, and let me try to subscribe. So it says, please fill out the form. all of these should look pretty similar when we're filling them in. It's just kind of using these dots. They're styled just a little bit different. And then you'll see we've got slightly different wording for our buttons. It's whatever the browser's default is. So this top one, this one's Chrome, where it has choose a file, and then I'll be able to pick one and it'll let me know if it's an image or not. And then here I've got choose file. And then the bottom one, it says browse. And that one's Firefox. So kind of similar. All right, so we're gonna take a little bit of a break from working with the input, and we're gonna take a look at some other elements. So this will actually get you pretty far in the requirements for the final, because you need to have your text, you need to have checkbox, you need to have a radio button, you need to have a submit button, and a reset button. So even all of just this is going to get you pretty far. And then the next thing we're going to have is our text area. Now text area is going to put us back at having opening and closing tags. So I'm going to put in h2 text area element. And actually, sorry, I should have said, so I was putting input element type text. This would also be input element, and then it's checkbox and radio buttons. I'll just put a hyphen there. And then this is also input element, hidden field, password box, file upload. This one is input element types. So this one is not that input element. It's going to be text area, opening, closing tags, and then anything that is between this is going to be what actually shows up in that text area. So you can technically put in placeholder text, and that would actually be what shows up in your box. Now, there's a better way of doing this. If you put placeholder text in here like this, the person is going to actually have to go in and actually delete the text from the comment before they can start writing in it. But I just want you to know that that is a thing that you can use. So the text area element is a scrolling text box, form control that accepts free form comments, questions, or descriptions. Some common attributes that you can use: name, ID, columns, and rows. So columns and rows is going to be how many characters. So if you want to specify how large the box is for starters, you could say like columns, you want to be equal to, let's say it's like 40. So you're going to have 40 characters, and then maybe you want rows to be equal to 3. And that's going to define kind of how large the box is going to be. You can have maximum length. So let's say that you're having a place that someone could like upload their resume and you want it to be only so long. You can choose disabled, read only, autofocus, placeholder. So placeholder would be a better place. That would be a better place for you to have text where you wouldn't have to go in and delete it. And it would just say add comments here by default. Then you can also do required. You can choose if it's going to have a hard or soft wrap. And then there's access key and tab index. So I'm going to put some placeholder text here, comments. It'll just be to the side. I'm going to hit save. And then refresh what this looks like. So right now I've got placeholder text here. Now it's not looking very good because I have both of these at the same time. But let me just have us look at this real quick. So we've got placeholder text, but again, like you'll notice that it takes up actual space. So that's going to be a worse user experience because someone has to actually go in and remove that. So let's see what happens if I actually delete this placeholder text. This is interesting. It looks like it's showing up, but for some reason it's not showing up in contrast. Oh, well now it is. So I've got add comments here is showing up, and then now I should be able to type, and then as I type, it'll go ahead and just kind of remove whatever's there. Okay. It's very curious to me that it's still putting in that information. It could be because this is returned on the next line. Let me see if I put these right next to each other if they're going to behave a little bit better. Whoops. Yeah, so it's because I had the tag on another line, so now it's going to behave fine. So just be really careful when you're working with that opening and closing tags that you put those next to each other. And then now with the placeholder, it has this add comments here, and then I can go in and I can type, and it goes ahead and removes it. So placeholders, really great to use there. And then the next one I'm going to go over, this is going to be working with two together. So there's going to be, let me just add in a break and return a bit. So there is the select, and then there is the option. The options go inside of the select to create a selection list. And you could think of this as a select list, a drop-down list, a drop box. But it's going to be a list of different options. And one of the great things about this is it helps to hide the option so you don't have to take up a lot of screen space seeing everything all at once. Because, you know, let's say that it's fine when you're just asking, do you want to be contacted versus phone or email, if you just have a few options. But let's say that you have the states and you're trying to choose which of the states that you are wanting to, let's say, like look for jobs in. And you want to be able to look through all those. You wouldn't want to have that take up the whole screen space by having enough space for all 50 different states on there. You would want to be able to click on a drop-down box and be able to just go and choose your option or a couple of different options. So we're going to do an H2. Oh, and I accidentally split up the wrong thing. Okay, so H2 is going to be our select and option element. And that's going to make our select list. So we're going to choose select. And this is going to give us opening and closing tags. And then our options are going to go inside of it. So inside of our select, we can choose some things like name, ID, size, multiple, disabled, tab index. So for this one, I'm going to say I want the size to be equal to 1. And I'm going to put name, I'm going to call this option list. ID will be also called option list. So then with our options now, I'm going to have option, and then you would choose the value. So they're all going to share the same location that they're sending the information to. So maybe we want to say like, what is your favorite color? And that's just kind of floating text, so I'll put a break next to it. So maybe we want our first value to be red. And then I'll just put red next to here. And then we have our option end tag. And then I'm just going to copy this a few times. So I'll do green and blue. And then I'll just add a couple breaks after it. So something else that we could use that I think will be great to look at is multiple. And this is another one like required where you could do multiple or, I've got typo, or we can do multiple equals multiple. So let me save that. Sorry. Refresh. So now I've got this drop down box where I should be able to switch through the options. For some reason, it's pretty small. It's a little bit hard to see. Now, something like this where you have multiple options, it might actually be better to change the size so it's larger so you can see them all at once. See what it looks like here. This actually looks better. Now this is curious. So this is Safari. For some reason, Safari is ignoring the size that I gave it, and it's saying, you know, I'm just going to show all of them. So for some reason, Safari looks at it differently. And I would say out of all of the browser, kind of the typical browsers working with Firefox, Chrome, and Safari, Safari tends to be the goofiest when it comes to showing up forms kind of correctly. So that's where it's helpful to see what this looks like and be able to preview in different browsers. So here we have the same thing. We can see our different options. Now it's a little hard to see multiple in something like this. Like here I can see multiple. And the way that multiple works is if you hit Shift while you're clicking through, you can click on multiple things. So if you are ever using a form and you want to test to see if you can click on multiple things, you could just hold Shift while you click on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole thing. What is your favorite color? Copy it, paste it, and we're going to make a second one. This one is going to show 3 values. So I'm going to change the size to 3, and the name has to be different. So I'm going to change that to option list 2. The ID has to be different. So I'm going to say option list 2, and then we'll keep the multiple, and then the values. Oops, I didn't even notice these should be changed as well. Green. I mean, this isn't going to be a huge deal because we can't see it on our end anyways, but might as well write it out correctly. So these won't matter so much, the values and everything. We can have the same thing multiple times. So now we can have multiple ones showing, and this would be really great. Like you wouldn't want it to necessarily be the same size, but let's say that we are doing our 50 states, being able to see 3 at once, that would surely help quite a bit in being able to browse through, because you can then see the one above it and the one after it and be able to have a little bit of an easier time selecting multiple things. So for some reason Safari is not quite showing it correctly, but we can see more of a difference here. And again, it's Shift clicking will let you actually click on the multiples. All right, so we are finally ready for working with labels. And so there's 2 ways that you can work with labels. You can work with them where they bookend the content, or you can use a for attribute. And the idea with the for attribute is you don't have to have the information right next to each other. And I'll try to give you a little bit of an example here. So let's say that we have our input. So with our label, what happens, this would be bookending. Whoops. Label. So we could have our label, and be careful when you're typing. I've seen a lot of people have typos where they accidentally do LE instead. So normally you would have your input, it would go inside of the label, and then it's just a matter of choosing if you want your text to go over here to the left or if you want your text to go to the right. So let me turn this into a simple one. So I'll do input type equals text. So we'll just have a little text box. And I'm going to copy this. I'll make a second one. And actually, let's put an H2 above this, and I'll call this labels. Or we'll do label element, because it's a little bit more specific. So in this case, you can have the text to the left, or you can have the text to the right. You can hit save. Let's refresh one of these. And you can see I didn't put a break, so they're on the same line. So we basically have, if you want the text to show up on the left, you can do that. If you want it to be on the right. So looking at what we have up above, the email, this is one where I think it looks better to have the field on the right and the text on the left. So you're reading the labels and then you're filling them in. But when it comes to something like this with like the radio buttons and the check boxes, I think those tend to look better when you have the check boxes on the left side. So that's one of the reasons why it's really great to be able to work with those in various ways. I'm going to go ahead and put breaks after these. So that's going to be using what I call, or the book calls, bookend. So bookending, just thinking about a bookshelf where you can have those little stands that just kind of go around both sides. So the other method is working with the for attribute. And the nice thing about that is you have the label and then you have your input, and I'll just do another type text. And so with this one, you don't put the input inside of this. So you could put whatever you want. You could have like an image between here. What's great about it is when you use the for attribute, you can use this for grids. And that's where it's going to be really, really great when you're working with your styles, is you can really think about putting your grid into multiple columns so that they just organize a little bit easier. So I would say the bookending is going to be easier and more straightforward, but it's going to be very limiting for what you can structurally do when you're actually putting everything together into an organized piece. So the for attribute is going to give you the most flexibility with your styles and being able to put them in multiple columns, even if you're not using grids. Though grids are a really great way to work with these. So we're not going to actually put an image in here. I just wanted you to know that you could put content in between. And so what you have to do is you have a for attribute and you would give a name. So I could say that it's going to be, we already had an email before, but we'll just call this email 2. So it's for email 2. And then in between the label, you would put the text that would show up. So I'm going to put email. And then let me actually put a break here. And then inside of your opening tag here, we need to say that the name is also equal to email 2. So in this case, it's the name that associates with for. So let me save that, refresh. And what's great about this is now we don't have to have the text right next to it. We don't have to worry about adding in a break there. I could just have the text over top of it. Or I could put it right next to it. I could put an image in between it. You could do all sorts of things with it. That's going to make it really great. So the next thing that I wanted to go over, that's going to be the field set element and the legend element. And your book has a really great example for this. And this is where if you wanted to group kind of similar content all together in one area, it's going to work really well. Now, the example they have kind of works a little bit better as its own little standalone, but we'll go ahead and include it here. We'll just kind of put it towards the bottom by the submit. So it's going to say, we're going to do H2 field set and legend elements. So you start off with the field set. And what this would be great for is when you are creating a form, you want to try to make it as easy as possible for people to fill out. You don't want people to feel really overwhelmed. So what you can do is you can group sets of information. So it could be all the billing address information goes here. All of the mailing, shipping information goes here. All of the credit card information goes here. All of the order information goes here. And then split it up into multiple pieces. So the legend element is going to be what the title of it's going to be. So we can do address form. And then that's where we can start putting in the rest of our content. So this example is going to give you a little bit of practice with the label. So you'll have label, in this case we're going to do street, and then we'll do an input inside of that. And I'm taking this from the book. I think it might be the same. I think mine's from the 5th edition, but I think you have the same thing in yours. So type is text, name is street, ID is street, size is 54, and then we end the label and then have 2 breaks. Do another label. This one will have city, space, and then input, type equals text, name equals city, ID equals city, and the label, 2 breaks. Label, this one will be state, the space, input, type. Now they're using one that is a little bit outdated, and that's called state. But you can also just do text. I'm gonna keep it like how the book has state. So name, ID will also be state. Now this one is gonna also have maximum length. So the maximum length that you can type in is gonna be 2 characters. So it wants you to abbreviate it, but it wants the size to be 5. So you can see 5 characters. And that might seem like a weird decision, but they're basically doing that because they visually want it to look like the zip code when you add that in next. So this one will be called zip code. Put type, we'll do text, name, zip code, ID, zip code, max length 5, size 5, and then 2 breaks, and then we've got the end of our field set. All right, so I'm gonna save that. We'll refresh. Now, each one of these might show it a little bit different, but you'll see that it basically puts this box around everything, and then the address form kind of breaks into that container. So same thing with this one. And this one as well. All right, so I'm gonna deviate a little bit. I'm gonna keep this file open just because I think it'll be easier for us to come back to this when we come back to looking at various different types for the input element. But I wanna give you an example of working with CSS, and there's a good example in the book. Now in my notes it says on page 330, but I have a suspicion that is from an older version. So let me double check to see what page that would be. So it looks like this is on page 364. But it's pretty straightforward. So what they're doing is they're showing, we're going to create a couple text inputs, and then we're going to have a text area and then a submit button. But to try to make it look a little bit more neat and orderly, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of change how everything is laying out. And then also you'll notice that they're using the for attribute method of working with label. And that's so that you can work with them independently instead of having to keep them all together. And then it has the list of all of the styles and everything. So that starts on page 364. So we'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to do file save as. I'm going to save this as forms CSS, and then this will be an HTML file. I'll do that, and it'll just end up saving another version of it. So then I can go in and I can just delete everything inside of the form. I'll change this so it says form CSS, form CSS. We can keep the rest of that all the same. That'll be fine. And then we'll go ahead and work with that example. And so they start off with the top where they have an H1 contact us. Oh, they're doing that before the form, so let me move that. Actually, let me replace this form CSS there. Okay, so we've got our form. And then inside of it, we'll have our label. For is equal to my name with camel casing. We'll have name with a colon and then our label. And then the next line. And that's what I would suggest is alternating label, input, and it'll make it easier to keep track of everything. So we've got input type equals text. And then name equals my name. So that way I can communicate with that label above it. And then ID equals my name. And then do label for this one will be my email with camel casing. Name, my email. And pay attention to this because this is going to be really similar to how you're going to want to do the labels and inputs for your homework. It's just this method of making sure that the for and the name works. And then also the names, you should do something similar where you have like my name, my email. It'll make it easier to keep track of all of it. Okay, so we've got my email. I got distracted and I started combining these little, so you don't need that name on the label. You just want that on the input instead. So name, my email, and then ID, my email. And then we'll do label for my comments. And this will be text area, name, my comments, ID, my comments. And then you can also specify, like if you want, like here it's supposed to have 2 rows, 20 columns. And then next we could do input type equals submit. Value will be submit with an uppercase S. And then that's all we should need for our HTML part. Save that. Let me minimize these. Alright, so this is what it's looking like by default, is everything is just kind of going next to each other without the breaks, and it's not looking very orderly. So that's where our styles are going to come in. So we have the styles where we're going to do form, background, color. It's going to be this kind of gray color, EA. The font family, it's going to be Arial Sans Serif as backup. Width is going to be 350 pixels. Padding, 10 pixels. Now we're finally using our float again. So we're going to float our labels to the left. Then we're going to display block. Width is going to be 100 pixels. Padding right 10 pixels. Margin top 10 pixels. Text align right. And I'm just going to read through these, and then once I have all of them, I can explain what's really going on with them. Do input, display, block, margin top 10 pixels. We'll do text area, display, display block. And then we can also do margin top 10 pixels. Okay. And then we need one last one. And this one is important because this is where people tend to get confused. So when you are trying to do a style for one of the inputs, you need to specify which type of input, unless you're talking about all of them. So here, if you want to do the submit button in particular, in straight brackets, you will say the type is equal to submit, so that it knows that it's doing this only for those that have the type submit. And then you can say, I want the margin left to be 110 pixels. Okay, so what we're saying, and let me refresh this so we have it over here. We can kind of look at it. So we're saying, I want the background color of the whole form to be gray. The text is going to be Arial sans serif. The width of it is going to be 350 pixels, so it's a fixed size. And then there's going to be 10 pixels of padding, just to give it a little bit of room. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, all of the labels are floating to the left, but they have a display block, so that way they are all stacking over top of each other. And then we have a width of 100 pixels, so no matter what, they're all taking up the same amount of space, and that's going to make it so everything kind of fits in a nice clean column. It's basically saying that there's a column here that's 100 pixels basically, and then it has padding right so that nothing will flow in next to it too closely, and then it has a margin top of 10 pixels to force whatever is above it to give it a little bit of room as well. And then it's aligning to the right with the text. And this is one of those few instances where I think text align right works really well, because then you have the text up close to your text fields. And so it's not as hard to read. And then we've got our input is block, so they're all stacking on top of each other. And then we've got margin top of 10 pixels, so it matches the text. And then same thing with text area. Technically, like this, since they're sharing the same values, we could do text area and just list them together and just remove this. That would be just as valid. And then what we're saying here with this submit button is we're trying to keep a good user experience where we just have this flow of going straight down instead of having to go to the left. So in order to keep this nice flow where you're keeping your mouse in the same point, it's saying, well, we know that these are all taking up 100 pixels and we know the margin is 10 pixels. So if we put a margin to the left of this button for 100 plus 10, so 110, then this will always line up here. So this works because it is a fixed sort of design, but it's not necessarily always going to work, which is why the grid option works so much better. So you can basically do this with the same example as a starting point. We've got the name, email, comments. You'll see we've got the same form and everything. The only difference is now it's going to change the form to display as grid. So if you're working on this on your own, you could take this file and just copy this text over. I'm not going to necessarily do that, but I can kind of walk through what's happening. So first we're saying the form is our container, so we have to change that so it's display grid. And then we have our rows, and the rows we're just going to, it's kind of like what we did previously when we worked with the grid, is we were more focused on the columns, and then everything else we just kind of let fit into however many rows needed to. So in this case, they're replacing this 100 pixels, and they're saying we're going to have two columns. The first column is going to be 6M, and then the rest of it is just going to be whatever the rest of the space is going to take up. And so it's going to let everything kind of fill in that space. And then there's going to be a gap of 1M, which is going to go in between these. Background color is gray, font family Arial. The width of everything is going to be 60% of the window space. The smallest it can get is going to be 20M, and then it's going to have padding of 2M. So it's just going to make it more responsive. Actually, you know what? Let me copy it. I'll see if I can comment out that and just put this in. All right, so that's that part. And then this other part, input type submit. And you might recall working with this. This is where that picture with the line helps a lot. So it's saying that everything else is automatically filling in where it needs to go. We don't need to specify, but because this one, we want to make sure that let's see where that drawing is. We want to make sure that this box doesn't get filled in with the submit. So we're going to have to say for the input type submit, I want to make sure that it fits between the grid column line of the second column and the third column. And then I want the width of it to be 10M and the margin left to be 0. So copy that. All right, let me refresh that now. All right, so it just is going to make this a lot more responsive. And it's going to be easier to work with it as a grid. So that's a really good example for you to reference and use for your homework, and then also for your final project when you get to that point. All right, so there's going to be other kinds of inputs, and these are ones where I don't necessarily know that we need to go in and actually type these out. Let me see if I can find the page where your book talks about it. More text form controls, page 374. So these are ones where you can be more specific, and it's going to be able to recognize if it's actually that thing or not. So rather than just putting in text for email, you can actually use the type email, and it's going to be able to recognize if it's an email address. So it's going to look for that @ information and then the .com or whatever might be at the end, .edu. So there is the email address input form, and then there is the URL form input control. So it's going to look to see if it's an actual URL address. There's a telephone number input control, so it's going to look to see if it's a telephone number. And then there is a search input that's going to be able to look up different keywords. So those are all going to be really handy for you to use. Now, the book also starts adding in some other ones. Now, this one is a data list element, and some of the ones towards the end of the chapter, these are specific to working with HTML5, which means that older browsers might not be able to show these the same way. And so you might have to have kind of a backup option for how you might show this information. Usually what happens is if an older browser can't show what these elements look like, then it just shows an empty text box by default so that you could still type in the answer. So for the example that is here, and I think what I'll do for these ones, just so that this goes a little quicker, is I might just kind of talk about the example and then copy the code over so you can see how it actually functions. But what happens here is we've got our label and it says for color, favorite color, and then input type is text. And what you do is you create a data list, and the data list gets associated with this list attribute. So we have just kind of a regular text box, name, color, ID, color, and then list colors. And then you create this data list, and the ID for this needs to match the name of this over here. So that way the list colors gets paired here. And then you list all of your different options. So let me just copy this. And let me reopen that form file, and I'll just put this in here. So we've got our label, data list, and then we've got all of our options. Whoops. All right, so what happens here is I can type in a color, but it's also going to suggest all of these as different options. So you could pick like what you think are going to be the most likely things that people are going to want to pick from. But then you can also allow people to type in something. So if it doesn't exist, so it has all of these colors, but maybe your favorite color is brown, I can start typing in, and you'll see it's suggesting, do you want black? Do you want blue? And now I can type in brown, and that still would get passed on as information, but you have that other option. So those should show. Let me see if I still got this open in Safari, and then I think Firefox. Oh, here. I don't really need that one anymore. So let me get these all set back up. So we've got, this one is Firefox. So I have to kind of click on it twice to show these. This one is Safari. I can click on that. And then we had Chrome. So let me try to make that take up a little less space. That was the first one that we looked at. So that's going to be our data list. They have a nice example here. And then next I combine slider and spinner controls. And these are a way for you to visually represent information. Now this uses the type called range, and you can choose the beginning point and the end point. And for this example, what they do is they just have this free floating text called low and then free floating text called high. And they have this label above it, choose a number between 1 and 100. Now, what's a little weird about this is it doesn't actually tell you what the number is. And so if you were to try to guess, like it's good if you want maybe a slider for like volume or something, but without really knowing what the number is, it's not really great feedback. But they've got this little example, and I can copy that real quick so I can show you what that would look like. in the different browsers. All right, so this one is Firefox, and it's just giving us this bar going across. This one is Safari, same thing. And then this one is Chrome. So Chrome and Firefox, you'll notice, often look very much the same. And with JavaScript, you probably could find a way for it to actually read out the information and let you know what's actually there or not. Let's see. Next is the spinner control, and this one is going to have type equals number. And for both of these, if you are using an older browser like Internet Explorer, it'll just show up as a text box where you would just type in the number instead. So even if you don't have the actual slider, you can still see it. And this one, it creates these little steps where you can click up and down. What's really interesting about this too is you can also choose not only the minimum and the maximum numbers, but you can also say like by how many you want to increase. There's this step, so you could step by 2. So you could do 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. So you can change how it's going to increase. Let me just copy that. Put this example in next. Let me do some breaks. Oh, for some reason I just copied the same one twice. See if that actually copies. All right, so this is Firefox. So I've got this box. I could type in a number. Whoops, sorry. And then I can click down. Now this one has a maximum of 10, so I can type in 111, but then what happens is if I click up or down, it automatically goes down to whatever the biggest number is. So it's not going to let me go beyond that number. Here, I've got the box. Let me try doing the same thing. Type in 111. So this one's a much smaller box. This one, you can't really see the stepper until you click on it. But they're all going to be very visually similar. Next is date and color wheel controls. The date one is one that you do have to use for your final project. And there's some information here like date time local, time, month, week. But the only one you have to worry about is just the regular date. You don't have to use any of those other ones. And it uses the type equal to date to set up. And this one I really like looking at in the different browsers because it looks pretty different. And this one's pretty straightforward. Like it has label for my date, choose a date, type date, name, my date, ID, my date. So there's really not a whole lot you have to say about it. Okay, so, oh, and I should have added some breaks, but we've got choose a date, and it's giving us a place where we could type in month, day, and year. If I click on that, it's going to bring up this calendar, but if I already knew what date I wanted to type in, like if I wanted to type in today's date, I could go ahead and do that, and it could pick it for me, or I could use this calendar. So this one is Firefox. That's how that calendar looks. This one, oh wait, I already refreshed this one. This one is Safari. So we've got this little date here. And this one is actually putting in today's date as a placeholder. That's kind of interesting. We've got little tiny calendar here. This one we've got a little calendar. I like this one. This is Chrome and it's got this little calendar icon. I think that's a nice touch that it includes. So I really like that. And then we've got our color wheel form. This is going to be type equals color, and it'll bring up these different color options where if somebody didn't have this, you could just type in the name of a color instead. And same thing with the date. If this calendar didn't show up, you could still type out the date in that same structure and it would be fine. This really doesn't have a whole lot. It's just input type color, name my color, ID my color. So that one I also don't feel too bad just going ahead and copying what's exactly there. Let me put in some breaks this time. All right, so this one is Chrome. So it's just gonna put this box here, and then I can choose my colors. We've got the HSL color slider, and then we also have RGB. We can click on here and it'll switch it to HSL. And then we also have hexadecimal. So it gives us a few options for working with it. And then this one's Safari. I can click on that. And we've got these predetermined color palettes. I can choose show colors, and it'll show this little box where I can switch between this color wheel. I've got different sliders, and then I have kind of predetermined color names. And then they've got like these little colored pencil look. And then let's see, we need this one. Firefox also brings up my Mac thing. So that might look a little bit different for you, whatever that's going to show up on a Windows computer if you're on a Windows computer. And then from here, they just give you more practice being able to work with the labels and being able to test things. Like here they have the required field, so you can see that they've got it looks like they've added a little rating system, so you can practice using that. All right, so that's really everything for this video. If you end up having any questions, whether it's about the assignment or if it's just working with forms in general, or if you've got questions now on the final project, now that you're at a point where you should be starting to work on it and everything. And like I said, with the final project, let me go back to the description. Now that we've actually looked at these forms, you need a place to put in text, a submit button, reset button, at least one checkbox and one radio button, but I think those work better when you have some context, a date text area, and then a select with at least 3 options. So I would say this is going to be pretty straightforward. Now, it's kind of up to you what you want to base your form on. You can make it a contact form, you can make it like a newsletter subscription. I've had people do it like a survey where they're looking for user feedback, or maybe it's a questionnaire. Maybe it's asking someone like, what is your prior knowledge? What information are you more interested in finding out about? You can kind of base it however you want. You just have to have these things. And it might seem a little silly to include some of these things. Like I know sometimes the date is a little bit hard to find a way to include, but I'm going to be grading it more based off of having all of these things in your form. So find a way to make it so that way it fits with that content. So if you've got any questions, you can leave a comment in the discussion, or you can send me an email.